What is portraiture? Portraiture is a type of photographic application which places a person as the main subject. The intent is to display the likeness, personality, and sometimes even the mood of the person. A photographer that has contributed massively to portraiture is Saul Leiter. Leiter is an American photographer born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1923. He was originally going to become a rabbi but moved to New York to study art. While in New York, he met Richard Pousset Dart, a painter who was experimenting with photography, and also met W. Eugene Smith, who was an American photojournalist. Through these people, he began gaining an interest in photography, which his artwork influenced in regards to composition and tone. During the late 1940s, he began to work with color photography. Leiter was one of the first photographers to use color in his photos. While the first commercially successful and practical color photography process, autochrome, was introduced in 1907, most photographs were taken in black and white until the 1960s and 70s, as it was believed that color distracted from content, making the shot superficial. However, I believe that, especially due to his background as a painter, Leiter's use of color adds to the photo, helping to draw our attention to particular subjects and helping to emphasize the mood of the image. Despite the fact that Edward Steichen presented Leiter's work at the Museum of Modern Art in 1953 in an exhibition titled Always the Young Stranger, he remained almost unknown until the 1990s when a gallery owner, Howard Greenberg, discovered his work. Other than his job as a fashion photographer for Harper's Bazaar, which he eventually also quit in the 70s because he felt that it was too corporate, a lot of the work he did was personal. He once said, "A window covered with raindrops interests me more than a photograph of a famous person," and that in order to build a career and to be successful, one has to be determined, one has to be ambitious. I much prefer to drink coffee, listen to music, and to paint when I feel like it. He also once said, "Being ignored is a great privilege. That is how I think I learned to see what others do not see, and to react to situations differently. I simply looked at the world, not really prepared for anything." I believe that his attitude that caused him to shy away from the corporate world really did shape his photography and art, as a lot of his photos are revealing the beauty in what would usually be considered ordinary. The first photo I'll be looking at is Outing, which was taken in 1948. This image is one of Leiter's earlier images. Even without colors, Leiter manages to create an intimate atmosphere through the use of composition. He takes his photos through a car window, creating depth. The inside of the car acts as negative space, and the window also almost acts as a frame for the woman. This decision to include the car within his photos allows you to immerse yourself in the photo, imagining you're there. The next photo I'll be analyzing is called Snow, which was taken in 1960. We can see that this photo was taken indoors, in perhaps a cafe. This photo is a portrait, as the subject is the man on the other side of the window. The window is placed between the camera and the subject, but despite the fact that the condensation distorts the man's appearances, rather than acting as a barrier, it adds to the image, making it feel more candid, something the audience would encounter in their daily lives. The great thing about Leiter's images is that he is able to create a very intimate moment and draw out the beauty in what would normally be disregarded for being mundane. The condensation also helps establish the positive and negative space, as some of the condensation that would have covered the man's face has been wiped away. However, the foregrounding of the condensation in a window, which is supposedly meant to be the negative space, is challenging us to look at the negative space as well as the positive, and to question which is the true subject. The unclear border between negative and positive forces the audience to take more time processing the photograph, which I believe makes it more successful, as the ambiguity will lead to audiences interpreting the image in different ways. We also see a yellow truck in the background, and while people could argue that this messes with the positive and negative space, I feel that the yellow truck helps to emphasize the man's feelings and emotions, as there is a juxtaposition between the saturation of the truck and the man's clothes. The fact that the truck is right behind the man's face also helps to draw out the man as a subject, and perhaps emphasizes the dull and distant character. The third image I'd like to look at is Shopper, which was taken in 1953. Although the woman's face is distorted, I believe this photo is still a portrait. This is because the woman is still the subject of the photo, and while we cannot see her face, this lack of detail evokes emotion and gives us insight into her character, which is the ultimate goal of a portrait. The blurring creates a sense of mystery which draws people in, similar to how one might look at a stranger walking down a street and wonder what's going through their mind. I think what also makes Saul Leiter's photos so intimate is that he captures and solidifies passing thoughts that lots of people have at some point, but also very often dismiss. The mind has a habit of trying to draw conclusions. There's always this natural curiosity within everyone, and the ambiguity of Leiter's photos takes advantage of that. The image itself has a very scattered and distant tone through the use of composition and framing. There's a juxtaposition between the very jarring lines of the mirror and the blurry reflection of the woman. Her upper and lower body is split, and we see these small scratches and defects that create a more natural and candid tone. In fact, these images seem more honest and revealing, as if they are trying to draw out the hidden characters of the subject. The little details help build a character and story around the woman, making the image more personal and intimate. I would also like to look at this photo, Red Umbrella, which was taken in 1957, where we once again see how Leiter uses composition and color to his advantage. The framing of this photo is unconventional as the subject is isolated and cut off at the top right corner of the frame, but by doing this, Leiter adds emphasis to the subject. This is still a portrait as the positive space is made up of the person and they are the main focus of the image. The isolation of the subject makes the image more intimate as we are solely focused on the woman with the red umbrella. There are also leading lines that draw emphasis to the subject. The color red also creates an intimate atmosphere as it is often associated with love and passion. I also chose to analyze this photo due to the fact that the context and application was a little different. This was a photo for Harper's Bazaar, a fashion magazine. I mentioned earlier how a lot of Leiter's fashion photography did have a style, but wasn't as exaggerated or obvious. I think this is the image closest to his more preferred style. There is a lot more distortion and depth here than in his other images for the magazines. The context does affect his style as his job has specific requirements, which in this case is to advertise and show what the products are, meaning he can't be as experimental with blurring and very dramatic distortions we'd see in his personal images. The framing seems a lot less natural than his street photography, and the composition is also quite conventional as her head is in the top right of the rule of thirds, evoking a sense of beauty. Despite being a beautiful image, there isn't as much of a connection in regards to personal identity in this photo as it would in his street photography. However, he adapts to these constraints on his creative freedom and still manages to create intimacy. He manages to make this image look candid as there isn't any direct address, and the image itself is very soft, creating this sense of subtle beauty that draws the audience in. Another photographer I wanted to look at was Mark Cohen. Born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, he was another photographer who was able to create an intimate atmosphere within his photos. However, his approach of achieving this was quite different to Saul Leiter's. While Leiter appreciated subtlety and tried to create intimate atmospheres through highlighting the beauty of the ordinary, Cohen often described his method as intrusive. The result of this was a very different take on intimacy. This photo is called the Upside Down Girl. From the beginning, we can see that despite using the same application, Cohen's take on street photography is very different to Leiter's. A lot of Cohen's images are close-ups of his subject and uses flash, which brings out a lot of details, and according to Cohen himself, you get very sharp and clear pictures of the subject. He also doesn't look through his viewfinder, which makes his photos seem a lot less simulated. The girl is in the center of the frame, drawing attention to her, and the direct address creates a sense of intimacy, as though she recognizes the audience. This contrasts Leiter's style, where there isn't a lot of direct address if we are able to see the subject's face at all. The second image is called Laughing Man's Teeth, which was taken in 1976. Once again, this photo is a close-up. It's very gritty and sharp, and it shows all the details of the man's features, making it seem more realistic and adding to the intimacy of the photo. It's also candid, immersing the audience almost as though they were actually there. There's a clear divide between positive and negative space as a lot of the light is focused on the subject, achieved thanks to Cohen's flash despite the fact that it can often be considered intrusive. I think the most important factor which helped both photographers create intimate atmospheres was that they took photos of people and objects we would often consider to be quite mundane and dismiss. Their unique styles and approaches to street photography help bring out the beauty in the ordinary and allow the audience to identify with the subjects in the photographs, or feel as though they could have seen any of these subjects while they were walking down the street, And the fact that we see our daily lives reflected in their photography is ultimately what makes them so memorable and intimate.